Good evening. I want to remind everyone where the bathrooms are. There are brand new bathrooms that are on my left out in the nice lobby. But in case those are full, there are also bathrooms, women on the left-hand side going down the stairs and men on my right going down the stairs. I want to thank you if you were here a couple of weeks ago when Native in New England, the women from different Native tribes were here, and we had some wonderful music. I hope you enjoyed that. I also want to let you know that next week, the 7th of December, is our last week. The name of our program is Sound Unbound, and Paul D. Miller, aka DJ Spooky, will be here. I also want to let you know that after this evening's presentation, there is hot cider, at least it's hot now, and cookies out in the lobby, and we invite you all to join us there. The person we have asked tonight to introduce our special guest is also a special guest. She is Dr. Cynthia Hamilton, Professor Emeriti in the Department of Political Science and African American Studies, and actually a founder of African American Studies and its first director. May I introduce you to Cynthia Hamilton, who is down at the bottom of the stage.
I want to thank the committee for bringing this old lady out of disability to introduce your next speaker. I am delighted to introduce Miss Melissa Lacewell. I'm sorry, Dr. Melissa Lacewell. What allows me to be so excited about this, I really feel like I'm old guard, Afro-American studies. But what gives me pleasure is to know that the thoughts that many of us had many years ago are still alive and well with youth. Because indeed, Dr. Lacewell is part of youth. She is young. We really do have a new generation of young people, of students, of faculty. And what's delightful is that they like being a part of the people. They don't like to see themselves as separate. So it didn't take much for Dr. Lacewell to find herself in New Orleans. Even though she has a partner from New Orleans, she went there after Katrina. She brought groups of students there. It was something that she felt passionately about. Now, many of you might know Dr. Lacewell from MSNBC. You were all part of the new network generation. So I'm sure Twitter, tweets. I am old guard, okay? I have an excuse now. I have tremors, so I can't do any of that. But it is delightful. Let me say one last thing about Dr. Lacewell. Her first book, Barbershops, Bibles, and BET, were the start. It's her effort to look at Afro-American political thought from the bottom. But it's her next book that many of us anxiously await, Citizen Sister, a text for Black women who have looked at politics when being strong was not enough. I'm looking forward to that. I give you Dr. Lacewell.
That was an incredibly generous introduction. Thank you so much. And it meant a lot to me for a lot of reasons. Sometimes in the New Guard, we feel as though being an African-American woman, social scientist, it can feel like there wasn't a path laid because there's still a lot of bramble on the path. And so I am so appreciative to know that there is, in fact, a path there. And I'm also incredibly appreciative, not of the disability, but of all the abilities that are still there. My sister was diagnosed with MS in her early 30s and has lost her sight and is dealing with the challenges of mobility, but she has, like you have, an enormous spirit that fills up the whole room and makes the rest of it pretty insignificant. So thank you very much for that introduction. So I'll also say, for those of you who maybe do know me from MSNBC, that I am sorry to have changed both my hair and my name at the same time. I know that's a lot. And, you know, especially for white folks who aren't really used to black women's hair, and then I changed my name too, they're like, what? Are you related to that Melissa girl from Princeton? But it is still just me. So I married my best friend just less than 2 months ago now. And so I am now Harris Perry after spending quite some time as Harris Lacewell, but I will these days answer to almost anything. I'm going to actually talk to you a bit tonight from my new book project. So as much as you are anxiously awaiting it, boy, I would like to be done with it. And it is in those final stages where it's sitting on the editor's desk, and so should be out in summer. But there's also this part of me that wants to keep writing and rewriting, because I'm writing about black women's politics, and it is changing moment by moment, day to day. So let me just jump in a bit. You all, of course, know the text. All the blacks are men and all the women are white, and some of us are brave. And this is, in so many ways, what our discourse around race and gender sounds like. As soon as you start talking about race issues, particularly those around African Americans, we just go to the gender male. We sort of can't help ourselves, right? You say, what are the big issues facing black people today? And you start hearing about black male underachievement, or you start hearing about the prison industrial complex. And those are real and critical issues, but there's also ways in which they frame all of blackness in a male body. Similarly, as soon as we start talking about women and the contributions that women make, it just feels like we're constantly talking about white women and the concerns and issues affiliated with white women. During the 2008 campaign, I kept getting calls from reporters, and they would say, Professor Lacewell, you're a black woman. Are you going to support Barack Obama because he's black, or Hillary Clinton because she's a woman? And I always thought, like, how many white men did they call and say, Joe, you're a white guy. Are you going to support Hillary Clinton because she's white, or Barack Obama because he's a man? Right? We wouldn't do that, because those are, of course, our unnamed categories. So what I'm up to here is trying to move past this dichotomy that I think was reinforced during the 2008 elections. This idea that all the women are white, that women's political power lives in the body of white women, and that all the blacks are men. So it was the classic moment, of course, Barack Obama versus Hillary Clinton. And of course, the question was, who will be first? And so for all of us who were standing at the intersection of both womanhood and blackness, perhaps it meant that we were going to win no matter what, but I also suspect it might have meant that we were going to lose no matter what. My training in feminism and thinking of myself as a feminist scholar came relatively late in life, in large part as a junior faculty member during my years at the University of Chicago, under the tutelage of a fantastic queer studies, political scientist, African-American woman, Kathy Cohen. And Kathy taught me at that time that feminism as an academic discipline could simply be a question. It could be lots of things. But one of the things we could think about it as an academic discipline is just a question. What truths are missing here? Always plural. What truths are missing here? So whatever truth you think you've uncovered, and social scientists, we think we operating in proofs and truths all the time, she would then always ask, well, who's missing? What's missing? What truth aren't we catching? So in this 2008 moment, I want to ask what truths were missing. Even as we were catching the Hillary Clinton story and the Barack Obama story, what were we missing? How are our understandings of race and gender shaped by our assumptions and our historical realities? How do they structure our political futures? And what might happen if instead of focusing on the black men and the white women, we looked at a different category? We looked at women of color. What might that open up? What categories might that challenge for us? So, my project is this: Black women's interior lives as a site of citizenship. How do we end up with black women as citizens, as political actors, as those working in the world to make change? And I actually suspect that at least part of the answer is in a surprising place, in people's interior lives. Now, let me be really clear. I think that black women can be the archetypal citizen. Now, we don't do this very often. We tend to think of citizen, and we go again to the notion of white, male, young, heterosexual, normative. But I just want to say, I'm going to tell a story about black women, not because I think it's only happening to black women, but in fact because I think if we tell the story about black women, we'll open up the story for everybody. It's my nod to Toni Morrison, that we can tell the specific in order to tell a much bigger story. So I think that when we show up in the voting booth, we're not just coming as Democrats and Republicans, we're not just coming as political persons, we're coming as whole persons. And I'm kind of interested in what happens in our interior lives, our emotional lives, our psychic realities, that impact what we do in the ballot box. Now, in a post 9/11 world, that's not that surprising to say, right? Your fear influences your politics. Your anxiety influences your politics. Your joy, your optimism, your sense of change influences your politics, right? We have a sense of that in our contemporary discourse, but I want to play around with it a little bit here. Do you guys know what's happening in this picture? This little boy asked his president to bend down so he could rub his head because he was astonished that his president had hair like him. Now, this picture messed me up the first time I saw it. And I get that there's a cultural resonance here, that folks who have not experienced what it means to go to your first sleepover and have to explain why you have to wrap your hair in a cap, or to be a teenager and have to go to a pool party and not swim, not because you can't swim, but because what will happen to your hair is something you don't want to talk about. Or what it means to be a professional woman who's moving to a city and actually needs to ask your potential boss, are there any hairdressers around here? I mean, I know that if you haven't had those experiences, this moment might not get you here, but I'm telling you, if you've had them, then this moment makes you feel like, well, okay, Afghanistan, whatever, because this was good, right? There's a way in which you get to forgive Barack Obama all kinds of crap, because at this moment, he provides a hair role model for a little black boy. And by the way, he's married to a woman who, thank God, has completely regular black girl hair. It is. I will talk more about Michelle later, but one of the reasons that I often forgive Barack Obama being to the right of me politically is because I know that he has smelled perm, and I know that he has dealt with rollers, and that he loves her despite that just pleases me to no end. So, but I want to caution us just a little bit about this moment, because this moment got me in my gut, and I thought, yes, there is something powerful happening here, something visceral and something very embodied about blackness. But there was also this letter to the editor. I'm sorry, and that should say 2008. It was just after the election. I hope that all children, but especially black kids, will consider Obama a worthy role model. Too many black kids see sports and the entertainment business as the only way out of the inner city, where all black children live. But Obama has proved that a black person, especially one raised by white people who went to Harvard, can achieve success in any arena, and that there is no ceiling that a person of color can't shatter. Okay. So I love this role model moment where he bends down and we get the visceral experience of blackness and the sense of connection with one's president, but then there is this role model language that just makes me want to throw something. Because it's so based in a set of assumptions that I find startling in the 21st century. Right? Assumption number one, that the main thing that a person can be is a role model to people in their own race. Assumption number two, that the main reason that black people don't do better is because they just lack imagination. If only they could imagine that they could be president, then they'd be more equal in the world. Assumption number three, that it's actually easier to become president than to become a sports star in the entertainment business. And I got to just tell you, it is still definitely much better to encourage your kids to go into the NFL than become president. There will be way more NFL players, just way more, it's just pure numbers. So there's all of these weird assumptions. Oh, and number three, that no white people get rich from sports or entertainment. I mean, it's just, there's a whole lot of weird assumptions going on in a moment like this. So I want to resist the role model idea. It is, however, standard language and argument for fair distribution of resources. You regularly hear role model arguments invoked as a way of saying why we should have a more diverse world. So I'm not quite ready to throw it out, despite how nauseating I sometimes find it. And again, at its core is an assumption that inequality is primarily a lack of vision, a lack of ability, the lack of ability to see oneself as something. I was speaking to a group in South Carolina, and I had a gentleman say to me, look, I'm from South Carolina, I've lived here my whole life, I'm a white man, and this, after the election of President Obama, was the first time that black men looked me in my eye on the street. And so I know that he has made them feel better about themselves. And I said, actually, we felt fine about ourselves. It's y'all that we're surprised at. Like, you guys electing him made us feel great. So we're looking at you, not so much because we felt downtrodden about ourselves, but because we are suddenly amazed that there may be coalitions that we didn't previously think were possible. And so I want to just suggest the possibility that inequality is not just sort of an inability to imagine oneself as great, and yet, right? So I'm deconstructing it because I want to give it back to us. I do think, however, that there is something compelling about the notion of role models. It just looks a little different than this. And here's what I think it looks like. I think it looks like Carol Stack's conception of fictive kinship. So Carol Stack, the brilliant sociologist who tells us that fictive kinship creates these ties between people who are not actually related. So of course you all know that when we call each other brother and sister, we're not actually each other's brother and sister, right? It's a fictive kinship for black folks to do that. It is a notion that in part helps to negate the negative racial images by providing positive ones. You hear it every February, right? McDonald's Black History Month facts brought to you by Tom Joyner or just by McDonald's. Why would it be important to know that Garrett Morgan invented the stoplight? Why does that matter? Why do we care if Charles Drew was an important pioneering scientist? Well, it matters because we assume a fictive kinship that says if Harriet Tubman was great and she is my sister, then her accomplishments are relevant to me. If Marcus Garvey was great and he is my brother, then his accomplishments are relevant to me. If Martin Luther King was world-changing and he is my fictive kinship, then his world-changing capacity resides in me too. This kind of fictive kinship is this mechanism of linked fate that we know is critical for political thought and action. We actively socialize around pride-inducing role models. It is part of what marginal communities do. If you look at marginal communities when they're first doing history in the academy, it is often just naming. Early feminist work is like, there were women standing there when? Early queer studies work, yes, we were alive then too. Early black studies work, Crispus Attucks. Just the idea that we were present in history, that we are not written out of the story, is part of the active engagement that we have with the notion of role models. Hold that for a moment, because we're going to come back to fictive kinship. I want to introduce you to the crooked room. One of the reasons we need the positive role models is because of the existence of the crooked room. In the years immediately following World War II, people were really interested in a concept called field dependence. The extent to which your perceptions were dependent on the space in which you found yourself. I find these studies fascinating. They would take a person and put them in a room with like a movable chair. They'd close the door to the room, and all of the angles in the room, the door, the artwork on the walls, the mirrors, the angles of the room themselves would be slanted. And then they would ask you to find the true upright, true north in the crooked room. Some people were pretty field independent. Despite the fact that all of the images around them were crooked, they could find straight up and down. Many, many, many people are field dependent. They could find themselves as much as 35 degrees on an angle, but experience themselves as though they were straight up and down. They were so dependent on the stimuli coming back to them that even though they were at an angle, it felt like they were authentically straight up and down because everything coming at them was crooked, askew, and askance. And when I first read those studies, I said, that is just like being a black woman in America. It seems to me that part of why we need the positive, reinforcing, fictive kinship role models is because America is a kind of crooked room for black women. It is a space that is continually providing feedback that says, actually, you're not a scientist. You're not an educator. You're not a leader. What you are is a mammy or a smart mouse sapphire or a whore. Those are the things that you are. And in fact, let's do plenty of reality television to reinforce that. I think part of the way we can understand what black women's politics is about is through that metaphor of trying to find the upright in a crooked room. Now, what are the effects of existing in a crooked room? If what my unrelated fictive kin do that are good can give me pride, then what my unrelated fictive kin do that is deemed bad can create shame. If the accomplishments of unrelated black persons on the planet and in history can make me feel good about myself, then the foibles, failings, degradations of unrelated black people, both in history and at this moment, can cause me shame. If my fictive kin can create my self-confidence, then their failures or perceived failures can threaten my self-image. In other words, the flip side of pride is shame. And if racial pride is political, and we know that it is, then I believe racial shame is also political, and that black women are particularly vulnerable to collective shaming. Now, just so you know, because I know parents use shame a lot, that's okay. Shaming that is reintegrative is fine. So here's how you shame your child. You're in church, your child is making noise, you stare at your child. You have taught them that they are acting against the social norm, your child grips it up, they pull it together, and then you look at your child like this. Right? So you have reintegrated them. You have encouraged them to recognize that their behavior is something they should not do, and when they have been ashamed, then you bring back the love. That's not the kind of shame I'm talking about. I'm talking about stigmatizing shame. Shame that says it's not something that you do or fail to do. It is simply who you are. It is your body. It is your existence. It is your personhood that is fundamentally stigmatized. That is shame. This is the Goffman conception of shame. Now, shame has a couple of elements that make it different than guilt. You can feel guilt all on your own. You run over your sister's cat backing out of the driveway, you can feel guilty about it. But shame requires that either someone is watching or you believe someone is watching, or you think someone might watch or you think someone might see. It is social in nature. Shame is about transgressing a social boundary. Shame is global. You might feel guilty about running over the cat, but you don't think to yourself, I'm an animal killer who doesn't deserve to live. No, you think just, I've had an accident. By the way, my father actually did run over my cat, and he saw me give this talk once. And he was like, really, 30 years later, are we still talking about this cat? So apparently I have a little trauma about this cat. But shame is global. It makes us feel like our whole selves are malignant, that everything about us is bad. And shame, of course, has a physical posture, and it is not this, right? Shame makes us want to retreat, to hide. Now, we know that shame is implicated in all kinds of negative psychological outcomes, including depression. We know that it activates physiological responses like cortisol. If you know anything about cortisol, you know it's a very, very nasty bodily reaction. And it turns out I could create cortisol in you right now by encouraging you to think about something that you have done in your life that makes you feel ashamed. If you think about it very carefully, if you close your eyes, if you say, I am so ashamed of myself, and then I walk through here with a swab, I can swab out and find a cortisol response. But it turns out that not only can I do that, but for black folks in the audience, I can also say things like DC sniper. And when I say DC sniper and you remember that the DC sniper was black, you too will have a cortisol response. But it turns out if I say to the white people in the room, George Bush, you feel fine. You feel just fine. I can say Britney Spears. You're like, psh. Because in part, the activation of fictive kinship does not obtain. When you are part of the majority group, it does not obtain that the bad acts of other members of the majority group reflect on you. This is true for heterosexuals who just sort of walk through the world. Heterosexuals are messing up marriage. Heterosexuals are getting divorced. Heterosexuals are making a mess of the world. But you feel fine because you do not have fictive kinship with other heterosexuals. But if I can show you a shaming queer moment, for many LGBT folks, you will see cortisol responses, right? So it's not exclusive to black women, but it is primarily related to being in a marginal and stigmatized community. And all individuals who don't conform to social norms are more exposed to chronic shaming, and I'm going to argue that stigmatizing shame undermines the precepts of our liberal democratic social contract. Now, how does it do that? Our society selects certain groups for shaming, marking them out as abnormal and demanding that they blush at who and what they are. And when this form of shaming is codified in law, its effects are pernicious. Shame motivates brutal social practices like honor killing, domestic violence, and rape. If we go through some of the most brutal social practices in the world, they are often related to shame management strategies. So when I'm talking about shame, I'm on the one hand talking about the psychic experience of being in the crooked room and trying to find the upright. I'm trying also to nod to the political experience of being part of a stigmatized group. Okay, so let's bring it back. Part of why we engage in our democracy, part of why we give up some of our perfect freedoms from our state of nature, part of why we engage in the social contract and sign on the dotted line is just about safety, right? At its core, even the most libertarian folks generally believe that the state should at least protect our borders. But I think that if we go to a fully sort of minimalized notion of public life or the social contract, we miss that the other important part of it is what Hegelian philosophy gave us, this idea of a mutually affirming recognition, something that allows us to operate as equals within the social contract. Think about it in the context of family. It is not enough to just feed all of your children, but to only speak the names of a couple of them. Right? I mean, let's say you have 5 kids. I come from a family of 5. Imagine that our parents fed all of us, clothed all of us, housed all of us, but only ever spoke the names of my sister Dana and my brother Will, and sort of pretended the rest of us didn't exist. That would be an insufficient set of relationships. Now, the state is not your family. That gets real problematic when you do that. But I just want you to know that part of why we engage in social and collective life is not just to eat and to be housed and to have roads and to have health care, although that's great. But the other part of it is to be seen, to be recognized, to be fully and mutually reaffirmed. So citizens need fair resources, but they need more than a fair distribution of resources. They also need meaningful recognition. And as we talked about today in class a bit, redistribution of resources and recognition are linked to each other. If you never think about the fact that there are transgendered and gender nonconforming people in your community, it will never occur to you that you need restrooms that are not just male and female, but also those that provide a safe space in public for people who are gender nonconforming. But if you refuse to recognize that gender nonconforming people even exist, then you will never know that that resource needs to be set aside and distributed. Okay. American racism and sexism are not just about the distribution of resources, they're also about shame. You'll see here signs from a Jim Crow, Alabama store. Now, it is quite clear from even one of these signs that if you are black, you should not come in this store. And yet, the language about Negroes and apes and sending Negroes not wanted in the North or the South, but send them back to Africa where the Almighty put them, and my favorite, that apparently they're truly religious people because they're closed on Sunday. This kind of signage was not just about segregation. This kind of signage was about shaming. It was about forcing African Americans to assume the posture of shame. Think about one of the things that will happen if you need to feel happier during the day. One of the things you can do is just take a physiological position of happiness. Smile. It'll make you feel happier. So imagine if it was legislated and protected through lynch law, that in order for you to be in public space, you had to take on the position of shame. Head down, eyes averted, not coming into contact with others in public space. For 100 years, we actually legislate the physical posture of shame. And it relies on the constant and disapproving surveillance by whites, legislating the undesirability of blackness, with sexism performing very similar processes on women's bodies. Now, this is not just a problem of power structures, of the state, or of white folks. It turns out black men do a very, very good job of shaming black women as well. It's part of how internal community policing maintains these same norms that we see in the broader community. So there's our friend Tyler Perry, who somehow got his hands on Ntozake Shange's For Color Girls. And we know that the ways in which black women have been shamed include definitions of them as hypersexual, as mammies, the ways in which they were publicly degraded during Jim Crow, the ways in which black women are often blamed for social disorder, for example, by being called welfare queens, the ways in which they were labeled matriarchs in the mid-century, described as welfare queens in the 80s, and how we continue to see black reproduction as a kind of malignancy. That when black women have children, it's seen as a contribution to social disorder. Okay. These have real-time consequences. How many black women do you suppose have ever been on the cover of The Economist magazine? Not many. I mean, probably, I think Condi made it once. Condi Rice probably made it once. There's probably a couple of others. What's this woman's name? Yeah, of course you don't know. So there are very, very few black women who ever make it to the cover of The Economist. This woman who makes it to the cover of The Economist apparently has the ability to shame the entire country, and yet we do not know her name. believe that Hurricane Katrina was a kind of explication of this whole process of the collective shaming and the real-time consequences that it has for our policy. There was a moment as soon as the storm hit where Katrina was being read as a black men's story, and the story went something like this. A storm has hit, bad things are happening, and black men have gone crazy. They are looting, they are raping, they are burning, they are destroying, they are shooting. In fact, both the governor of Louisiana and the mayor of the city suspended relief efforts in order to put all police resources on law and order. In a city that had just lost 85% of its housing stock, law and order came in front of search and rescue. But then, within about 2 days, the story began to shift, and it started to shift because the images were not of black men, they were of women and children. And in a country that still fancies itself a place where women and children should go first, Hurricane Katrina and its images of black women suffering retained the capacity to shame America. And yet, we don't know her name. We don't know her story. We don't know where she is right now. We don't know if her family survived the storm. She's not important. It was just her body on which the story was written. So, just real quickly, I did a study right after Katrina of about 1,200 Americans in order to figure out what difference did it make that black women were the bodies through which the story of Hurricane Katrina was told. You guys understand a basic experimental manipulation in a study, right? So you're going to get one of four possibilities. You'll be randomly assigned, right? Either this image of a black woman and her two children, and you either get the language more than 100,000 Americans were displaced from their homes as a result of the Katrina disaster, or more than 100,000 refugees were displaced from their home, right? So you think the blackface with the word American, or with the word refugee. Or you get this image with the words American or refugee, right? So you get this. You either get black American, black refugee, white American, white refugee. And then we asked what we thought was a pretty sort of straightforward and kind of soft question. And it's either the federal government should spend whatever is necessary to rebuild the city and restore refugees, if the language you got was refugees, Americans, if the language you got was Americans, or it's a great tragedy, but the federal government shouldn't commit too many funds until we know how we will pay for it. We got this dependent variable from a post-9/11 survey where we said, do we spend whatever is necessary to bring the people who did this to justice, or should we pause first and figure out what the cost to the American people will be? And just as a guess, what do you think the general percentages were on whether or not we should do whatever is necessary or wait and see how much it costs? Yeah, Americans were like, do whatever is necessary, right? And this is Americans across the board. Black, white, conservative, liberal, Democrat, Republican. In the days immediately following, we were a country that said we must do whatever is necessary to bring people to justice. So in this question, we said, do we do whatever is necessary to restore people, or do we wait and figure out how much it's going to cost first? And the results, first of all, show that there's just a tremendous general racial divide, that for African Americans, these numbers approach the 9/11 numbers. We must do whatever is necessary. As you can see, for white Americans, it is much more likely for them to say it really depends on the cost. But not only was there this main effect, but in fact, white respondents are statistically significantly less likely to support spending whatever is necessary when they get the black woman's image and the language of refugee. The dominant framing post-Katrina, black women shamed out of their position as citizens into their role as refugees. There is a real policy consequence here, right? So again, I'm trying to make a claim that it's not just a psychic feeling, it's not just what it feels like to look at black women suffering on television. It's also that it has a real policy consequence, reducing the likelihood, the willingness of Americans to in fact spend whatever is necessary to restore and rebuild. Now, this is my favorite moment of the 2008 elections. It's my favorite moment of the 2008 elections. It happened right after the North Carolina win, when the Obamas knew at this point he'd wrapped up enough delegates to win the nomination. The nomination battle went on longer, but this is when you knew you had enough delegates. It's this kind of spontaneous moment where Barack and Michelle come up on stage and they greet each other with a fist pound. Now, for me, this moment was like being white. And it was like that because there was my president, not yet, but I was starting to get an inkling at that point, greeting his intimate partner in a way that was so familiar that it didn't need speaking. It was just, yeah, of course, I have friends who did this at their wedding, right? It was so common, so regular, so just, yes, there we are, standing there being ourselves, except we're standing there being ourselves like about to be president. That just is not a common experience of blackness in America. The Du Boisian double consciousness that you are always dealing with two selves about to be torn asunder. Moments like this kind of stitch those together as though there were really no distinction at all between being black and being American. Now, the next day, this moment that was so familiar, so common, so regular, so ordinary, so deeply satisfying, was rendered as the terrorist fist bump. So much so that my 8-year-old daughter, who was 6 at the time, we started to call it the terrorist fist bump. So even now in the morning, like when we leave, I'll say, give me a terrorist fist bump, and right? That this would be read as terrorism was indicative of my point that in the 2008 elections, we got Barack Obama, who's a fascinating figure. And we could spend all day on Barack, but we won't because this is my Black women's lecture. So we're going to talk about Michelle. And part of what Barack Obama is a green screen, which is to say he purposely created himself as a kind of everyman, a kind of blank screen onto which you would cast your thoughts and ideas. Remember that there were Irish who walked around with, or who drove around bumper stickers that said, "Oh, apostrophe Obama." Right? Or if you remember the 2004 DNC speech where he said, there's not a red America, there's not a blue America, there's just the United States of America. I remember when he did that, he kind of told his story, right? He said, I'm an immigrant, you're an immigrant, you have a mama from Kansas, me too, are you black? So am I. I'm from the inner city of Chicago and the coast of Hawaii. I went to school in Indonesia and Harvard. I mean, there was no one in the room who couldn't say, yes, me too. Right? He was purposely, actively the green screen onto which we were supposed to cast ourselves, and it was critical. No one could have been president as a person of color without creating that sense of identification with Americans across the board. But Michelle Obama is not a green screen. Michelle Obama is much more specified, much more specific. She's not an immigrant, she's a slave. She's not from Indonesia, she's from south side of Chicago. She's not got white folks, she worked with some. Michelle's narrative of American blackness is simultaneously much more familiar and therefore much more frightening. Or we think it's more familiar. And we think we know what her story is. And so because we think we know who she is, she requires translation in a way that Barack Obama did not. And so this moment was like Barack slipping into Michelle, slipping into a kind of blackness that then required translation. So let's look at Michelle for a moment. The New Yorker cover spent a lot of time in its anxiety about that rendering of Barack Obama. And it's a troubling rendering, but I will say this, there is a picture of Barack Obama wearing an outfit like that. Right? When he was visiting North Africa, he put on an outfit like that. Now what they're doing here is taking it out of context and they're giving it a political meaning and valence that it doesn't have, but it is not completely imaginary. Michelle Obama has never had a natural. Let me be really clear. Michelle Obama is from the part of the south side of Chicago where not even infants have naturals. This has never happened. Combat gear and a gun. I mean, and the craziest part is that, like, moments after this, an actual woman candidate who actually carries guns actually showed up in the election. right? I mean, we didn't know at this moment that Sarah Palin was on the way, right? We didn't know. But Michelle, it is completely imagined. So from whence is it imagined? From whence is this rendering of Michelle Obama as some kind of Angela Davis hunter? From whence is that imagined except a place in the American psyche that sees black women through the lens of the crooked room? So I want to ask this question. Michelle Obama is not a political figure in the sense that she hasn't run for office, she hasn't been appointed to any office, and yet, because she is consistently at this moment the lens for black women, our fictive kinship with Michelle Obama has not only personal psychic benefits and costs, but also political ones. So let me just suggest two. I love these pictures. If you have not yet seen the hula hoop series, please go Google the Michelle Obama hula hoop series. This is early on. It's the first spring of the presidency, spring of 2009, and they're hosting kids, and these are very embodied pictures of our First Lady. You rarely see a First Lady, first of all, in short pants, and then running around. I'm going to show you some other ones of her running on the lawn, but they're very embodied pictures of her. And Michelle's body has been part of the national dissection. Remember when I said there's a crooked room? Two of the most critical crooked room images are mammy and hypersexuality. And the hypersexuality one often operates around the body. This is indicative. Now, let me be really clear. I think we dissect women into parts as standard practice of how we talk about women. I mean, in fact, if you are a girl child and you get educated through women's magazines like 17 magazine and then you someday read Cosmopolitan, you are encouraged to do this to yourself. If you watch Extreme Makeover or What Not to Wear, this is how we treat women in general in the American political system. So let me be really clear about that. But it has a particular valence for Michelle Obama because of the history of the Hottentot Venus. So if you know the story of the Hottentot Venus, you know that she was put on display. She's a South African woman, put on display in the Piccadilly Circus for her supposedly abnormal behind and sexual organs, and even after death, she was dissected and her body parts kept on display in a museum well into the 20th century. When I hear the language about Michelle's butt or about her arms, as we so often hear it, or recently Rush Limbaugh having a conversation with a caller who said that Michelle had gained weight and therefore didn't have a right to be doing this kind of healthy children initiative. And the caller, was saying that Michelle had gained weight, but Rush Limbaugh kept saying, well, where did she gain weight? Where? Tell me where? And by which he apparently didn't mean the White House. Apparently he meant where on her body, and he was clearly trying to gesture towards her posterior. This idea that, again, she, like the Hottentot Venus, is capable of being dissected. So if you're in the crooked room and you're being shamed for being this embodied black woman, this kind of bigger than life, big, tall black woman with arms and with a behind, with a body, you have some choices about how you would try to find the upright. Now, one possibility, a very reasonable possibility, would be to put on a jacket, to sit down, to become a little bit less embodied. The First Lady of the United States chose this picture as her official White House photograph. I just want to point out a couple of things about this picture. First of all, she is sleeveless in this picture. She is the first sleeveless First Lady in an official White House photograph. But I got to tell you, my favorite part of this, y'all know who that is behind her? Thomas Jefferson, I'm sorry. No, there have been a lot of people who've lived in the White House. You do not have to have Thomas Jefferson looking over your shoulder. That is not a mistake, my friends. Right? There she is with Thomas Jefferson looking over her shoulder. Right? A man who raped his teenage bondswoman, his slave, and that is rape, people. It is not an affair. He enslaved his own children produced from this relationship. And yet, there she stands, the first black first lady living in the White House as the mistress of the house, not as a servant or a worker in the house. A kind of self-conscious taunting, I think, that reaches back across that span of history. Repudiating that violence, owning that very body that is getting dissected, a kind of self-conscious effort to stand up straight despite those crooked room images. So much so that she chooses as her policy initiative her body. She actually invites scrutiny. She says, okay, we're going to focus on body, weight, fitness, and health. And we're going to do it on my terms. She actually invites the scrutiny of her body, not shaming, not putting on a jacket, but standing there in it, finding an upright in that space. Now, it is not without its own dangers. Because we know that the notion of black women as particularly strong and powerful has often been read as a valence of emasculating. And these old images about black women's bodies have to compete with the new Michelle images. But I suggest that her body, literally her body, is both thrilling and terrifying for African American women who are locked in a fictive kinship with her, asking her to do some of the work of straightening the crooked room for us. Now, I want to suggest there actually are two others, but I just want to focus on motherhood because I wanted to do the sex and the mammy image. Now, remember 2008 gave us not only Barack, it also gave us Michelle, and not only Michelle, but the girls. Right? Michelle is not just a wife, she's a mother, and this is very important. It leads us to ask, what are the expectations? What are the crooked images of black girls and of black motherhood? Both Michelle Obama and Mrs. Robinson, Marion Robinson, are both coming in as black mothers, two black daughters into the White House. And I got to tell you, she disappoints a lot of people when she, in those first months, says, my primary role is going to be as mom-in-chief. There were so many second and third wave feminist supporters of Michelle and Barack Obama who thought, finally, with a return of a kind of egalitarian double career family to the White House, we'll have a return of the Hillary Clinton model of the first lady, someone who takes on an active policy agenda. I mean, Michelle is clearly at least as smart as Barack. She also has a Harvard Law degree. She was also working. What is going to be her big policy agenda? And Michelle says, my primary role is going to be as mom-in-chief. And so many women felt like, oh, this is just going to be a Laura Bush presidency. I mean, we like her, she's nice, but we wanted you to do something. But I want to ask, or assert, or suggest, that when black women talk about domestic sphere, it is a different process. That when we talk about the idea of feminism as primarily being about having the opportunity to work, that story reads differently when we read it through the lives of African American, for whom work has not always been liberating. The mommy wars, as they are often understood, whether to work or not work, I think have often obscured the reality of the mammy wars that were existing underneath. That the question of work or not work has rarely been a choice for black women, and in fact that much of the work that black and brown women have had to do is precisely in caring for the children of the white women who make the choice to go into the workforce. So that the valence of the notion of work and staying home are different when they occur in a black woman's body. What happens when, a black woman becomes part of the opt-out generation? This Harvard and Princeton educated black woman who says, nope, thanks, I'm going to stay at home, despite the fact the home is the White House. Feminist strategies are always kind of grounded in these assumptions about race, class, and choice, but when choices are sought by women who are quite different, the kinds of choices they're looking for can in fact be radically different. I read, by the way, I love this picture. This is Barack and Michelle on the day that Barack was sworn into the U.S. Senate. And so there's Sasha being her Sasha self and Malia, and their hair is natural. And Dick Cheney is looking at those Afro puffs like, there's not even really any good reason to have this picture here, except that Dick Cheney having to contend with those Afro puffs just thrills me. Okay. I actually think that when Michelle Obama says she's going to stay home and be mom in chief, that she's thwarting the expectations of black women's roles in the family. She's representing a different image of black women than we are used to encountering. As mom in chief, Michelle Obama subverts a powerful discourse about black women as bad mothers. She says, I will not be the national mammy. See, what mammy is, let's remember, what mammy is a brilliant domestic. She can cook so well that we have, to this day, you can go buy Mammy's pancakes on your grocery shelf in the person of Aunt Jemima. She's an exquisite cook. She is a perfect housekeeper. Remember how she keeps Vivian Leigh's whole world running. Mammy shows up all the time. I went to see the first Sex and the City movie. I can't even talk about the second one, it was so horrifying. I went to see the first Sex and the City movie. No one had told me that Jennifer Hudson was a mammy in the movie. No one told me. I almost died. There's Jennifer Hudson, a 20-some-year-old black woman is what she's playing. She's playing a 20-some-year-old black woman against the characters in Sex and the City, who at this point are in their 40s. These women are in their 40s. They have been living in New York for 2 decades. They've had multiple career opportunities. They've been through multiple marriages. Carrie is a 40-some-year-old woman. She falls apart because her marriage doesn't work, and this 20-some-year-old woman who appeared in the city 10 minutes ago fixes her website, her personal life, her organizational life in 15 minutes flat. And kind of spicy the whole time while she does it. What? In the real world, 45-year-old women mentor 20-year-old women. So only in some weird, racial, magical world where mammies come in with all experience and knowledge just from St. Louis, although she sounded like she was from Louisiana, do they come in and fix the lives of the 45-year-old women. We encounter these magical mammies over and over and over again. And when Michelle Obama says, I am going to hang out with my own kids, she says that instead of ensuring order in the world, instead of suggesting that the broader public sphere is the most important thing, instead of saying that public policy is the most important thing, I'm going to say the most important thing happening in this world are these little black children. And it is quite a subversive kind of statement. But we can't read it as that if we're only reading it through the lens of white feminism. We have to be able to read it through the story of black women. So then we have to ask, can Michelle Obama help us to straighten the image of the crooked room? And I don't know. And the main reason I don't know is because right as I was getting excited about the ways in which Michelle Obama was standing straight, we found this moment, the vilification of Shirley Sherrod, the moment where, and I'm a Twitter person, Ben Jealous of the NAACP, within 10 minutes of the Andrew Breitbart story, breaking tweets. She should be ashamed of herself. Now, I just want to point out that the last name Sherrod and the state of Georgia should ring civil rights bells like a fire alarm. It would be like if I called you up and said, you know, Cindy Sharpton was just arrested in New York. You should go, huh? Cindy Sharpton, New York. I wonder if she's related to Al Sharpton. It should be that clear to anyone who knows anything about the civil rights movement, like, I don't know, you might expect the head of the NAACP to know. When you hear the last name Sherrod and the state of Georgia, you should think, huh, I wonder if she's related to Charles Sherrod, who, I don't know, liberated the state of Georgia with my friend, Julian Bond. He misses it. No clue. No idea who she is. Figures she's a low-level black woman bureaucrat, immediately takes the route of public shaming. And again, Sherrod is no Van Jones who will slink off in the night. She stands up for herself, demonstrating the extent to which she was existing in a crooked room that was prepared to see her as a liar and a racist, despite the fact that she was exactly the opposite of those things. And to see them not only, again, because white folks were seeing them, but the NAACP, not just an African American, but a leader of one of the lead and civil rights organizations. She kind of engages in direct nonviolence resistance against the crooked room. And yet the very fact that the crooked image was displayed and deployed against her so quickly makes me a little less enthusiastic about the capacities of a single person, even one as fabulous as Michelle Obama, to straighten those images. I am not going to do this stuff because clearly I've gone on too long. Okay, so I'm going to end here. Part of the work that we are up to is finding both political and personal authenticity. I don't think that the processes I've talked about here are exclusive to black women. In fact, I know that black women engage in these processes. When I talk about Michelle Obama, for example, I could also talk about how her heteronormative marriage has the impact of shaming families that are non-traditional. It is not as though to be subject to shaming, subject to a crooked room, means that you are not also participating in it. In fact, we know that many people will tilt themselves in order to be in line with the crooked images. I do think that African American women provide us with a particular insight into the ability to see how fictive kinship, processes of shaming, personal psychic anxiety have real political consequences in real time for policy, for the choices that we make together as a country, for our own social contract, and for our understanding and our ability to recognize and see one another. Shirley Chisholm, the first black woman elected to Congress and the first black woman to run for president of the United States, importantly enough said that she wanted history to remember her not just as a black woman to be elected to Congress or to have made a bid for the presidency, but, and this is key, because she sees this as clearly as much of a task as those political tasks. As a black woman who lived in the 20th century and dared to be herself, I think Shirley Chisholm is indicating that the effort of trying to stand straight in a crooked room is nearly as awful, full of awe, as an attempt to run for president or to be elected to Congress, that it has that same kind of valence to it. And so I see Michelle Obama there in that moment being so fully, authentically herself in a way that I find incredibly thrilling, but also incredibly frightening, because every acceptance of her is the possibility of straightening that image, and every declination of her is the possibility of making it even more crooked. And so I certainly hope that Michelle and that each and every one of us will find that we can say at the end that we lived in the 21st century and dared to be ourselves. Thank you.
Dr. Harris Perry will take questions. If you can line up over here for questions, that would be best, but I can come to you if you can't do that.
About Shirley Sherrod, two questions. Whatever became of her? Did she ever get her job back?
They came and offered her a job, but rather than offering her the substantive position that she had, where she was in control of a multi-million-dollar budget in rural Georgia, they offered her a job in a kind of diversity position. She declined to take that job, and as far as I know, is currently pursuing litigation against the USDA.
And who's the man she was with in that picture?
Oh, that was Vilsack, is that right? Vilsack, the head of the USDA, who had, I mean, it's one of my favorite pictures, right? Because he's just hugging her, he's so thrilled, and the look on her face, isn't that great look? Yeah, so that's that's him apologizing to her for having fired her, and she's sort of like, yeah, really? So, but he's got his eyes closed. He's really into that apology at that moment.
As for Jefferson, looking down at the Michelle, I once wrote to Time magazine about about Michelle and Barack beneath a picture of George Washington, picture of Time magazine. And I wrote to Time, I was just wondering what Washington must have thought as he gazed down upon them. It shows how much America's changed in 220 years.
It does. And you know, had she chosen Washington, that would have been interesting enough. But Jefferson, because of his particular relationship with the black, and you know, these are some of the smartest people who have occupied the White House in terms of pure knowledge of history. So you just know that was not an accident, that wasn't a mistake. There's a clear sort of gesture to Jefferson going on there. Yeah.
Hi, first of all, thank you for coming out here today.
Sure.
And I was going to say we definitely do need more role models like Michelle Obama. And particularly for our generation, I think that what we're dealing with besides pushing race under the table is that, you know, we're losing our identity. You were saying that it's not okay to be ourselves. It's not okay to have a big booty or, you know, to have curly hair or something like that. And I was also going to say that basically is not, it's saying that it's not okay to be you, and you're hiding your culture, you're hiding your traditions, and it goes back to feeling ashamed. And how do we deal with that now? Because we're creating dual identities. I was actually going to tell you really quickly that one thing I've been dealing with is that I've allowed people to call me Rosie when my name is Rosiris. And that's something that every day I feel like a piece of my identity I'm allowing for other people because they feel more comfortable calling me Rosie, that it's okay. Yeah. And, you know, I never really stepped up and said anything. So what do you say to us?
I really appreciate that contribution a lot. And, you know, interestingly enough, remember that Barack was Barry for many years, right? So for much of his childhood, he was Barry. I think because he felt a great deal of anxiety and attempts to fit in. And so Barry was the assimilated name that worked for him. And it really was in college when he finally found and became comfortable with the identity of Barack, right? And there's you know, my governor in Louisiana is Bobby Jindal, and of course Bobby is not Bobby Jindal's name, right? And so there's all kinds of ways in which naming, I mean, I love that you brought up naming, because naming is right at the core of much of this. And in fact, interestingly enough, Barack's name in and of itself was used as a shaming device during the election. Barack Hussein Obama, right? And so if you say it in this particular way or with a particular valence, it's a way of actively shaming. And we saw it with Sonia Sotomayor, where the Senate repeatedly refused to get her name right. The woman was being confirmed for the Supreme Court, and they would call her all kinds of everything, but they could not. I mean, Sotomayor is not that hard, and they just would not. They would not even attempt. People from Texas, you're like, come on, you know, you can surely say this name, right? So naming is, I think, clearly one part of it. You know, one of the arguments I made here is that anyone who doesn't conform to what we think of as the social norm is open to this process of collective shaming, and so it can happen in lots of ways. And it's why I have the anxiety. It's why I spent so much time on the role model anxiety. Because on the one hand, Michelle is an extraordinary role model and a deeply troubling one. Because just her heteronormative marriage, right? So it is not only heterosexual, right? It's also heteronormative, in part because Barack regularly says the most important thing for a child's development is to have a strong black father in the household. I think it's a fine thing to have a strong black father. I am all for it. But empirically, it is true that our actual first black president of the United States did not have a strong black father in the household. Not only did he not have a strong black father in the household, it is completely clear that if Barack Obama Sr. was still alive, little Barack would never have been president. Never. Because if his mother had stayed with them, because clearly she sort of liked to wander the earth, right? She wandered the earth with the second husband. She's an anthropologist. She likes to look at interesting cultures. She wanders about. So had they stayed married, she was loved and committed him, they would have moved to Kenya because he wasn't an immigrant. There is no immigrant story. He was just a visiting student. Then he went home, right? And so the family would have gone back, and little Barack would have been an American, because he is an American, he's not a Kenyan. But he would have been raised in Kenya, and he wouldn't be president. Which is fine. Maybe he would have had a better psychic life. I really don't know. But if you want to be president, a white mama seems to beat a black daddy twice a week at least. It is just to say that his lack of recognition about the ways in which his unusual family was incredibly important for forming him, and his determination to constantly say that only this very narrow conception of family is what children need, means that they are on the one hand this amazing role model and also really troubling, especially in a community where the vast majority of black children not going to have a strong father in the household. I'd rather him say, fathers, it'd be great if you were strong fathers, but kids, if you don't have one, you can be president. Or, I mean, that would be sort of exciting, right? Okay. So I say all of that to say that every role model, whoever we are, right, because we're individual persons and we're embodied, we carry with us all the package of good and bad, right? And we can always serve as role model for some things and then crooked oppressions around others. And so what I really loved about what you said at the end there is you're naming something going on in your generation. On the one hand, it is the most diverse American generation ever. It is extraordinary. Part of the reason Barack Obama becomes president is because y'all see race differently. But you're also indicating to me that as part of that diversity, it's not all roses and happiness and joy and lilies and flowers in the field. It's also a struggle to simultaneously have an identity that is American and an identity that is authentically who you are, that is drawn from your own cultural resonance. And I say, yup, the struggle continues. You probably won't solve it. But naming it, right, but naming it and knowing it, I think it's the very work that we're up to. So I appreciate that.
Hi.
Hi.
Thanks for coming. It was really, really interesting. Going back to Tyler Perry, which is an interesting thing. We had B.D. Wong here earlier in the semester, and he talked about the role the entertainment media plays in making social progress. And I'm wondering, how do you think satirists can toe the line between, being funny and effective, but also being undermining?
Yeah, I just don't think he's a satirist. I mean, so the New Yorker cover is an interesting example, right? And that's why I wanted to pause on it for a minute there, because the claim was that was just a satire, and clearly, well, I mean, they're a liberal rag. They're not, they weren't performing that. But part of the reason I wanted to pause is because part of why it works as satire for Barack Obama is because it's rooted in some reality, it's rooted in some truth. And so in other words, the actual image of him in that picture, right? And so what they do is they take that and they say, if you're looking at this through a lens that can't understand it, then what you would see when you look at this actual existing picture on the planet is this, right? It's sort of showing you how the kaleidoscope lens distorts what you're looking at. With the image of Michelle that they created, it wasn't a satire because it wasn't a riff on anything that was Michelle. It was an imagined imposition of a militaristic black woman from some other set of imaginings. It wasn't anything embodied in her. In other words, I think the better satire of Michelle is like to dress her up as a 50s housewife, because that's what she's performing, right? She's kind of performing this sort of 50 housewife version, but with these really edgy 21st century elements of it. But the satire would be to pick up the thing that is real and mess with. That's why the Tina Fey doing Sarah Palin was so fucking brilliant, because she would just say what Sarah Palin said. There was no script. She would just say it, right? I mean, it was, that satire, right? You take the truth and then you kind of, quirk your head when you say it, and all of a sudden the straight becomes crooked in a way that's very funny. So what happens with the Tyler Perry representation of black women is that he's making a claim to it as satire, because he's saying, y'all all know some big, fat, loud black woman who carries a gun and goes to jail and eats chicken, and y'all know that's real. And I'm like, oh, no, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. You don't know her. And the fact, Tyler, that you see me and that's what you see is deeply troubling, right? So, and it has, I don't know, for me, satire always, it's going to sound like a crazy thing to say, it always has I come from a family where people show you that they love you by teasing you. Like, the way that you know that my father loves you is that he teases you about the thing that hurts the most. It means he's been paying attention, right, to the thing that hurts you the most, right? So he will just, torture you about the fact that your boyfriend just broke up with you because he knows you're upset about it. Can't you tell my dad loves you? It's just, it took a little while to figure that out. That's different than just being an abuser who calls you awful names all day long, right? Because that's actually not even rooted in any attention to the detail of the person. It's just abusive. When I see Tyler Perry's representations of black women, I just see them as exquisitely abusive, horrifying. And it's in part because he does keep claiming somehow that it's true. And and the fact is, the main people who go and consume it and love it and show up for it are black women. And this was my point about complicity. It is not white folks that go to see Tyler Perry. It is not, for the most part, black men that go see it. It is black women who go and consume these horrifying, crooked images of themselves, right? And of ourselves. And in so doing, we become complicit in recreating, Medea and all of that. Yeah.
We'll take one last question.
Thank you. Hi, I'm a student at URI in Providence, and I'm very delighted to be here. I started following you, I think, in 2008. I have to say this because I've been dreaming about this for 2 months. And I remember saying I would crawl on ground glass to take a course with you because I still remember your dress that you wore to the inaugural gown.
Oh, yeah, it was a good dress.
Gorgeous.
That was a good dress, yeah. I wore that to Mardi Gras later. It's had a long life.
I almost cried. I was so excited. This is just fantastic. I'm a history major and a women's studies major. But thank you. And I'm old. I am a white person who is embarrassed. I'm sure I had that to the bushes. I just want you to know that. Very embarrassing. Thank you. And also the Tea Party. The Tea Party I find tremendously embarrassing. But that's not my question. I think what horrified me with Michelle Obama as this wonderful woman and such an exciting time is when she said, for the first time in my life, I'm proud of my country. And it just sort of like your take on that a little bit, because she got so much abuse for it. And I thought, that's just ignorant. That's being willfully ignorant, because everybody with a brain knew what she meant. But it was taken as such a racist thing, like the fist bump, just totally out of proportion. So I'm wondering what your thoughts were on that.
I even have a whole slide on it, but I won't try to find it. But I love that question because it actually goes to the core of something I was talking about at dinner with the students. So first of all, thank you on the inaugural gown, because that was it was really one of my most favorite moments, was doing TV in an inauguration gown. I mean, I have to say, like, all of 2008, I kept thinking, I can't believe this is happening. This is really, like, the whole thing, the campaign, and then getting to be part of it was very exciting. So I have a split screen slide that shows, because there were two moments with Michelle. It was that she'd said, this is the first time in my adult life that I'm proud of my country. And then the second thing was her senior thesis from Princeton. Because, in the senior thesis from Princeton, she says that she says she feels alienated from it. And so I have a split screen that shows Du Bois talking about double consciousness, and then Michelle talking about what it means to be black and a Princeton student, and they read very similarly. So clearly she'd been reading Du Bois, and she was reflecting on kind of dual consciousness. What does it mean to be both black and a Princetonian? How do I knit these competing identities together? So I didn't talk much about the citizenship side of this, except around the social contract and recognition, but I think one of the key elements of citizenship is that citizens are always allowed to critique their country, right? I mean, it's one of the rights of citizenship, one of the goodies, right? So you got to pay taxes, and you got to vote, and you got to send your sons to war, and you have a lot of things, a lot of responsibilities. But then one of the things you get to do in a democracy is you get to complain about it, and you get to say, it's a little bit like, you can't talk about my mama, but I can. She crazy, right? When your mother is your country, right, you might say, it's not really okay that you outsiders critique my country, right? Maybe I feel a little nervous about that. But part of what we get to do as citizens is we get to have a critique. We see it right now in the Tea Party. So I don't think, by the way, you should be ashamed of the Tea Party. I think that there are many things about the Tea Party that are extraordinarily wonderful. I think that when Americans express themselves, even when it's corporate sponsored, it's a great thing. And that part of living in a democracy is you live with people who you disagree with, and they're going to win sometimes, and you're going to win sometimes. And so I'm going to come to the answer on Michelle Obama, because the idea of a democracy is not that you always win. The idea of a democracy is that you are never a loser in a winner-take-all system. Democracy requires that even when you win, you share with the losers. Always. It's why, it's not staging a coup to win an election. You have to win and lose, and you have to know that your party, your state, your race, it's the Madisonian faction. You're supposed to be part of so many that you're always kind of winning and losing. The problem with the position of blacks in America has been that they have been losers consistently, always on the losing side, in a winner-take-all system where all the goodies were distributed with regard to race. Part of what the work of the past 100 years has been is about breaking that off and saying, well, we may be losing, but we don't get a little bit. We get a little bit anyway. We still get a little bit. Even though we lost, we're not out of it. I think what evoked such shock for so many Americans to hear Michelle Obama, a black girl from inner city Chicago, who was given the privilege of going to Princeton and now was married to a man who was potentially going to be the president of the United States, that she was not just fall on the ground grateful to her country was stunning. But it's only stunning if she's a subject and not a citizen. All citizens have critiques. Only subjects are expected to worship the mother country as though it is faultless. And so when the critique was, Michelle doesn't have a right to be critical, it is a way of saying you are not a citizen, you are a subject. Your job is to be grateful for the opportunities. And so what she said was, well, no, I'm an American. Americans can say great and critical things about our nation. It is what I see continuously going on recently. I was talking about the unemployment rate. 10% unemployment, which is currently driving the Tea Party and many, many Americans out of their minds. 10% unemployment has been standard in black communities for 20 years. For 20 years, black people have had 10% unemployment. At this point, we're up to 25% black male youth unemployment. 25%. And the main response to 10% unemployment in black communities was get a job. Stop being lazy. Do better. Improve yourself. But now that 10% unemployment is everybody's problem, it's a national crisis that's been caused by the government. These TSA pat-downs that we're all supposed to have such great moral outrage about, I'm 37 years old. I don't have one male friend, relative, intimate partner who hasn't been thrown against a police car and patted down at some point in their life. In Chicago, in New Orleans, in California. I don't know one black man my age. Not one. Old ones, younger ones, skinny ones, fat ones, real dark-skinned ones, real light-skinned ones, one you can't even really tell are black from a distance. Every last one of them has at some point been frisked and thrown on a car, and many of them handcuffed and some of them jailed inappropriately. And I'm supposed to just be on the floor because now middle-class white travelers are experiencing something in that same neighborhood. Our sense about what some bodies are supposed to experience and what other bodies are supposed to experience, what some citizens are supposed to be allowed to do and what others aren't, are so deeply ingrained that we don't even see them. When I say that to people, they're like, oh, that is true. Black men have been getting frisked for a long time. Why are we not morally outraged about that? But we're really upset about the TSA. It's not even that people are actively walking around doing racism. It's partly that we just sort of expect that black bodies will experience this. So when a black body, like Michelle's, experiences this world-altering moment, we expect her to go, thank you, America. And instead she was like, well, that's good, but y'all have been sort of sucking for decades at this point. and so it is, but look, I think it's great. I know that the reaction that what we think we should do when we see these moments is that we should lose hope and we should say nothing's changed. And I do hate that I don't have the slide now, but if you look, I want you to spend some time, Google lynching images. And it's horrible because, there's the murder and death. But the murder and the death in the pictures is not the worst part. It is that people turn and face the camera. It is that no one is hiding their face. No one is hiding that they have lynched someone. Now, it is a small step, but it is a step nonetheless that now people would turn their back to the camera. Right? It is a small step. It is not the process. It is not the end goal. But it matters that there comes a point where people turn their back to the camera, where to be caught lynching someone is hard. I know everyone's mad that George Bush said that Kanye West saying he was racist was the worst thing that happened, but I got excited. George Bush thinks that being a racist sucks. He thinks it sucks so bad that like 5 years later, he is still up at night like, I'm not racist. Good. Right? I mean, it'd be better if he were just not racist. But it is great. It is fabulous progress in America that he feels horrible about being called a racist. Because right now, if I'm like, you're a homophobe, people are like, yeah, I hate them. I want people to feel like, oh, I can't even believe he called me a homophobe. Let me check myself. So there's a way in which we are moving towards it. And so yes, that moment felt like trying to impose that crooked image on Michelle, but I will say it again, my favorite kind of racism is the one where the black guy becomes president. So yes, there was this moment, and yes, it felt outrageous that she wasn't allowed to critique, and yet she is the First Lady of the United States, and that wasn't possible 4 years ago, 8 years ago, 16 years ago. I said it to the young woman, we have to say it to ourselves, the struggle continues. We're not going to get it solved in this lifetime. A lot of smart people, committed, hardworking people have been behind us the whole way. We just take our relay, we keep moving, right? It is a struggle, and it's the whole good work of it. And there is still plenty of reason to take good courage and feel optimistic about where we're going.